the brain prefers to use glucose as an energy source above all energy sources. So we get this little pathway where we bring glucose in, chop it up, and we do all sorts of things, and we end up with this last little bit at the end of the glycolysis where there's pyruvate. And then we get into this little cycle called Krebs cycle, the pyruvate and the energy. And you can see here, if you blow it up, you're going to see energy from sugar, fats, and proteins. Eventually gets to this bit. And it goes around a thing called the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, and that goes on to this electron transport chain. So these are all part of energy. So we're going to look at energy. And finally, you have this lovely little picture of the electron transport chain. And as you look at the little things called iron sulfur proteins, there's FMN, which is part one of the B2 things that's activated. There's CoQ10, and most of you will have heard of ads for CoQ10, what it does. Well, this is actually what it does. It sits in here. It's a little shuffle. And then finally, you make ATP, and then here's the ATP. You transfer the ATP out of the mitochondria into the cell, and this is where creatine is involved. If you don't have creatine, you can't take that energy and do anything with it. And so creatine is critical. So creatine phosphate is phosphocreatine. You get energy for the brain. And so this way, if you have 1 molecule of glucose, you can get 36 molecules of ATP, and you can use it for doing things. Now, one of the critical things about making creatine, and you can see in this, is you have this final step, which requires SAM. SAM is S-adenylmethionine, which is the universal methyl donor, and you need vitamin B12 to make SAM. So without B12, or without this one little enzyme that's used, you don't make SAM, or you don't make creatine, and you get nearly all the symptoms of autism just from knocking one enzyme out. I'm pretty sure that this is basically the mechanism that B12 is using. So let's go through it. Vitamin B12 is involved in the production of melatonin. So if you meet B12 deficiency, you get a reduced production of melatonin. And so therefore you get lack of myelination of these neuronal stem cells in the brain. You also have some associated problems that a lot of people with children with development delay will notice, and that is they can have some gut issues. And so one of the other things that melatonin does is it helps in the maturation of the gut epithelial cells. And if you don't do this, you have sensitivity to histamine and lactose. And you also have some other curious things that are found, and you have poor uptake of iron and a lot of divalent metal ions in the gut. So that's one thing. So that's the two of the critical things that you find is this gut issues are really big in these kids. And you have these multiple food sensitivities and all these things that come up. And really it's because the gut hasn't matured. It hasn't matured to the extent that it can handle these things. It's not making the enzymes that it should to do it, and it's not making the processing steps in the gut. So it's a little bit like if you had severe diarrhea for months and months and months, you'd have poor nutrient uptake, and you'd have poor uptake of some molecules. And that's basically from the melatonin and the lack of melatonin, but it's slightly more complicated. So the other thing that we did was we talked about the energy production. So that's going on. And one of the things that B12 does is it's involved in methylation, and methylation is required to make CoQ10. So in that little electron transport chain that we had, there was a little shuttle vector that was taking energy from one side and moving to the next side. And that little shuttle was called CoQ10. So when we do the organic acids test, we can see that the CoQ10 precursor is made in abundance, but the CoQ10 is not being made. So the next thing that is made is creatine. All right, so we're going to go through the production of creatine. So over 40% of all methylation goes to making creatine. So you can see that if this is reduced, then the amount of energy transferred in the brain is going to be a lot slower. And so the developmental delay can occur just to this one step. As we mentioned, we knocked out this one end. So here's your CoQ10 structure. Here's the 3 methylation groups that are on there. These are methyl groups. Me is methyl, and that's a methyl group. and it's a part of the electron transport chain. And we can see here that one of the precursors, as B2 deficiency goes up, the amount of this precursor goes up. So it's not being converted to CoQ10. And so this is some data from all of the kids that I had, basically saying you're getting lower electron transport chain activity due to lower CoQ10. And here's the slide now that we have for creatine. And this is the synthetic pathway. This was the creatine. And one of the things that you notice, an early sign with the kids, is hypotonia, that they don't seem to have energy, that the muscles are limp and relaxed and they're not stiff and taut and toned. And this, we believe, is due to this creatine deficiency. The muscles are not getting enough energy to actually do anything. Tanya might have mentioned that her son had hypertonia for quite a long time. Yes. And it's another interesting problem is that you see it early on in development. It's one of the diagnostic things is hypertonia. And so it should be suspected if you see it. So the other interesting thing about creatine is that we say it's used for energy, and the brain, of course, uses lots of energy. And the thing that distinguishes us from other primates is that we have these large frontal lobe and temporal lobes in the brain. And these involve us to do a whole lot of things. Motor functions, problem solving, memory, language, judgment, impulse control, spontaneous and social behavior. We won't worry about sexual behavior in the children, hopefully not yet. But you can see that if you lack energy here, you're going to upset these problems. And the temporal lobes, which were early on, are involved in the formation of long memory. So if a child is going to learn to speak, it has to remember the words, it has to be able to put them together. And the other thing is recognizing faces. So the kids initially have problems with facial recognition, interpreting body language, and that's another thing. They don't know whether you're cross or you're happy or whatever. And production of speech. One of the biggest things that I get contact is, my child doesn't talk. I want my child to talk. From a grandparent, having the child say something and be able to make a comment is so satisfying. And to me, it must be so heartbreaking not to have your child to speak. But so this is part of why we believe it. Remembering the names of objects. How can you say what you've done? How can you say that's the cat or something like that if you can't remember what it is? And recognition of language. This is a whole new puzzle, but the temporal lobe is involved in this. And what we're saying is these require a lot of energy, they require a lot of creatine, and these are the areas in the brain that have the highest creatine. So these are the sort of functions that are involved with these two different areas. And you can see that if creatine is low, you're going to have problems. So you're going to have problems in these. And that's what you see in the children. So here we have Broca's area, frontal lobe, temporal area. And so methyl B12 deficiency has all these problems. Now, one of the reasons we know it has these problems is because when we have people with chronic fatigue who also have B12 deficiency, they have these problems as well. And when it gets worse, and you have people now who have dementia or Alzheimer's disease, these are the problems that they have. And low functional B12 is associated with this. So we have the end game, if you want to, which is dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And from that, we can learn what the children are likely to have. And I think that's very important. Biochemically, when you look at them, they're very, very similar. So yes, and it's an assumption, but I think it's quite a valid, what we would say, a learned assumption. So that's sort of dealt with the B12 aspect of it. I don't know if you had any questions on that, Tanya, or not.
Well, my question is, obviously, creatine plays such a significant role. A lot of people choose to supplement it. And I think that's something that maybe we should quickly touch on, like the supplementation aspect of it. Can we somehow address that, Greg?
So one of the things with creatine supplementation is that the evidence in the literature suggests that very little creatine gets to the brain. About half of the creatine that you use is derived from food. but only if you eat the right food. So if you eat muscle, which is high in creatine, so if you're a red meat eater, then you will tend to eat more creatine. And the creatine that athletes use as supplements has been shown to help them in muscle strength. And so for some people who can't get up and they have problems and they have severe hypertonia, I can believe that creatine will work for them. The problem is that they have not been able to demonstrate significant amount of creatine going into the brain. However, there's a contra side to this, and that if 40% of your methylation is going to creatine production, if you're supplying creatine, maybe you have more methylation available to make creatine in the brain. That's speculative, though. The data would suggest that, but I definitely can't prove it. And so one of the disadvantages to creatine is a lot of people have very bad side effects to it. My solution in these things is to fix the biochemistry, and then you won't have to do the supplementation with the other things. There's 200 methylation reactions in the body. Are you going to supplement with the 200 methylation products? Possibly not. So,
Great, thank you.